Oh, hello. Like you, I've been stuck inside for the last 4 or 5 days, and I've been trying to find something that I could do to contribute during this time of great crisis. Unlike medical doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals, we historical doctors have a skill set that is not an immediate need during a crisis. But it did make me think that perhaps there was something that I could contribute. While all of us are stuck inside, and while all of us are socially distancing, it does provide a pretty unique opportunity to learn a few things. And in concert and in conversation with Pastor Ian and Pastor Jay, I thought to myself that perhaps I could offer a short series of lectures on the history of the Western Church. Now, I'd like to make two disclaimers about this. One, the views that are going to be presented in these lectures represent my own. They don't represent those of Trucksville United Methodist Church. They don't represent those of my employer, Wilkes University. They represent me, Dr. Jonathan Kuka. Now, the second disclaimer that I'd like to make is that although I am a professional historian, I am by no means a scholar of early church history or church history in general. I've taught some of it. It comes up in my classes, so I will be learning just as much as you in preparing these lectures. So, with that being said, thank you very much for joining me, and I look forward to contributing what I can. So, enjoy the lectures. Okay, so we're going to begin our lecture series, which I'm entitling A History of the Western Church, with lecture one, which I'm entitling An Outlaw Faith, Early Christianity Before Nicaea, from approximately 30 to 325 AD. And as I said, this is lecture one. I'm anticipating trying to do this in about 6 lectures. We'll see. I'm hoping to maybe do one or two a week. So hopefully we don't have to do all of these because hopefully by a few weeks from now we'll be back together in person. But if that's not the case, we'll go through this in 6 lectures. And hopefully I'm going to be able to cover most of Western Christianity's history in those 6 lectures. So today, this first lecture, we're obviously focusing on the early days of Christianity as a distinct religion. It goes without saying that the Christian church emerges from the teachings of Jesus Christ, who lived approximately the first 30 or so years of the Common Era. And the key questions that we're going to really look at in this lecture are how Christianity goes from being a really fringe group of outsiders in the greater geopolitical and political social situation to being the consummate insiders, in particular in the Roman Empire. This is actually going to be a story that is going to have a profound influence on the future of Christianity as this group of people who follow Jesus in one of the most remote and poor corners of the Roman Empire, Palestine, shape a movement that is going to spread and grow not only in the Roman Empire, but in Persia and in other places as well. And become a major cultural and political and religious force. How this happens is a fascinating story, and one, as I said, that's going to have pretty profound consequences for the shape of Christianity. We're going to really cover about the first 300 years in this lecture, and some of the questions that I want to keep in mind as we do this are, how does Christianity survive periods of persecution? How does Christianity forge itself into a coherent movement? And how ultimately do they overcome crucial divisions in Christianity? Now, those divisions are going to stem from several different things. At the beginning of this movement's history, Christianity is going to be very much a Jewish faith, a Jewish sect. And so one of the very first questions to be tackled is this just another branch of Judaism, or is this something new? Another major question that's going to stem from this is who exactly Jesus was. There are going to be many followers of Jesus, many people who believe in Jesus's message, but people who are going to believe very different things about Jesus and exactly who he was. So as we go through these first 300 years, we have to keep in mind the fact that Christianity is actually an incredibly diverse group of thinkers and people believing an assortment of different things about these central issues of what is Christianity and who was Christ. So let's start at the very beginning then, or even before the very beginning. The situation in Palestine before the birth of Jesus Christ will tell us a lot about why these divisions and why these different schools of thought are going to emerge following Jesus's life. Jesus is born near the end of what's known as the Second Temple period in Jewish history. The Second Temple refers to the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem that began after the return of the Jewish exiles from Persia around 500 BC, 550 BC, I guess. And this situation in Palestine has been in flux for hundreds of years. Different empires have come and gone. The Jewish people have been independent for a short period of time. And in the period leading up to the birth of Christ, the land of Palestine has come under the control of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire really enters into this area around 63 BC, but it rules with a relatively hands-off approach for quite a long time. Rome very often would administer territories far away from their kind of heartland by using puppet rulers. And these rulers would rule in the name of Rome, would oftentimes owe allegiance to Rome, sometimes even pay taxes and things like that. And the person who is ruling in the name of Rome around the time of Jesus' birth is someone very famous who shows up in the New Testament, and his name is Herod the Great. Now, Herod was technically king of the area of Palestine known as Judea during this period of around the birth of Jesus Christ, which many scholars think happened probably around the year 4 BC. So our calendar is actually a little bit off. Now, Herod is a local ruler, but a very ambitious one. He is known for his violence, and he is widely reviled by Jewish people. He's viewed oftentimes with distrust by Romans as well. But Herod does the job. He keeps the peace in Palestine. He administers the land in the name of Rome, and does what he's supposed to do. But Herod's bloodthirstiness and his willingness to tyrannize the people creates a situation in Palestine during his reign that feeds on a lot of the instability and a lot of the problems even before this. This period of kind of violence and flux and instability in Palestine gives rise to a certain strain of thought within Judaism that focuses very much on the coming of the Messiah. The idea of the Messiah in Judaism is something that has developed at different times and has really been an emphasis at different times in Jewish history. And this idea that a member of the Davidic line would come to liberate the Jewish people gains great prominence during this time period. And that makes sense, right? Having a tyrannical, bloodthirsty ruler, people are longing for some kind of liberator, some kind of hero to come free them, right? And so Herod rules over this land, but also very vital to this situation are the Jewish religious leaders. And Jewish thought is divided into several distinct schools of thought, the most famous of which are the Pharisees and the Sadducees at this time. But there are other thinkers as well, including a group known as the Essenes that live near the Dead Sea in a place called Qumran. And these Essenes are very ascetic people. They live in poverty and have a very kind of apocalyptic bent to them. This idea that the Messiah is coming, that the end times are coming, right? So the reason I talk about this is that when Jesus is born, and even at the time of his ministry, the political situation in Palestine is very much on edge. It's very tense in Palestine. There are numerous different schools of thought within Judaism, a lot of them focusing on the hope of a Messiah, the end times being near. And so you can see why Jesus's message would hit as it did and would strike such a nerve at this time, and why so many people could view Jesus in so many different ways. Part of the reason that Jesus is ultimately crucified is because many of the Jewish leaders believe that he is just another one of these people claiming to be the Messiah, a rabble rouser, someone who's going to provoke a revolt or rebellion that could potentially bring down the hammer from the Roman Empire. And so Jesus is not the first person to make these claims at this time. And as such, he fits very much into this kind of unstable situation in Palestine. So when Jesus is ultimately crucified and buried, many people thought that this was just the end. This is the end of another false prophet, the end of another false Messiah, and things would go back to normal. So it's quite a surprise when Jesus's followers stick around, and even more surprising when they claim that Jesus was not dead, but that he had risen from the dead. Now, the reason why this becomes such a important kind of moment in the political history of Palestine is because these early followers of Jesus really don't know what exactly to make of their situation. If we read the book of Acts, you see that the early church after the death of Jesus is kind of scattered, it's confused, and only slowly starts to come together as a coherent group during Pentecost and in the days that follow. And one of the central kind of questions that these followers start to grapple with is who exactly Jesus was and what exactly Jesus's message was meant to do. Now, the earliest members of the Christian movement, who were called members of the Way, even before they were called Christians, were almost invariably Jewish. And these Jewish followers continue to practice traditional forms of Judaism. They continue to follow the Torah and the Mosaic Law, and really thought of themselves as kind of a completion of the Judaic tradition, that Jesus was the Messiah, that he had brought to fulfillment the prophecies of the Old Testament. And many of these Jewish Christians therefore considered the future of their movement to be very much a Jewish movement. The earliest leaders of the church, Jesus' disciples, were oftentimes centered around Jerusalem, although some did move out. And the Jerusalem church comes under the leadership of St. James the Just, who is oftentimes called the brother of Jesus. Now, there's dispute as to whether James was actually Jesus' biological brother, or maybe a cousin or a family member of some sort. That's kind of beside the point for right now. But the fact of the matter is that this situation comes to become a little bit trickier when a Jewish leader named Saul, who persecutes the early church, converts in Damascus and changes his name to Paul. Now, we all know Paul from the New Testament. He's becomes one of the most dynamic missionaries and leaders of the early church. But Paul really opens up a can of worms for this early church as well. Paul, quite early on, makes it clear that his mission is going to be towards bringing Gentiles into this Christian movement, not just Jews. Paul's missionary journeys, as you can see from this map, take him all over what would be considered the Eastern Roman Empire, what today we would call Turkey and Greece. And his missions in these different places bring a tremendous amount of Gentile converts. And now Paul also begins to shape understanding of who Jesus was through his many writings to these churches. And it's not that Paul necessarily disagrees with the church in Jerusalem or disputes them, but Paul opening up this whole world of Gentile converts creates a central conundrum in the early church, which is,
do these people have to become Jewish in order to become Christian? Um, and this is really at the heart of one of the first great controversies of Christianity. Now, this is ultimately decided that the church, that the Christian movement is going to be open to everyone, and that Gentiles do not have to abide by Mosaic law in order to remain part of the Christian church. And so this is kind of confirmed later on by the fact that St. Peter, who was one of the leaders of the early church, ends up becoming Bishop of Rome, the capital of the Roman Empire and the seat of, Gentile power. So this kind of tension between the non-Jewish and Jewish part of Christianity remains a central theme for the first about 100 years of the Christian church's existence. The power begins to decisively shift towards the Gentile part of the church, especially after the Great Jewish Revolt of 70 AD, when Jewish revolutionaries, known as the Zealots, stage a revolt against Rome, which ultimately results in the sacking of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Jerusalem is taken by the emperor, by a general named Titus, who is soon to become emperor of Rome, and the temple is destroyed. Now, the destruction of the Second Temple and the displacement of the church from Jerusalem outward really does start to shift power towards the non-Jewish members of the church. And this is when Christianity first starts to come to the attention of the powers that be in the Roman Empire. While the Christians remained just a sect of Judaism, they were more or less flying under the radar of Roman authorities. Judaism had a kind of long-standing relationship with the Roman Empire that had been defined mostly by kind of an uneasy partnership. The Romans actually practiced a form of cultural cosmopolitanism that was pretty extraordinary and part of their strength. To be Roman was not necessarily an ethnic thing. It was more an idea that you kind of bought into this idea of being Roman. And part of that idea was not necessarily buying into every aspect of Roman culture, but it was more or less a kind of appreciation of the fact that to be Roman was to be loyal to the Roman state and to allow your personal beliefs to exist alongside the existing Roman institutions and Roman ideas. Now, Judaism had always fit kind of awkwardly with that, in large part because to be Roman means to buy into some of the key ideas of Roman religious belief, which was very complicated. But one of the central tenets of this was the fact that emperors were often elevated to divine status after they died. So when Caesar Augustus dies, for example, he becomes a semi-divine being. And part of being loyal to Rome, therefore, is performing sacrifices to some of these semi-divine beings like emperors and whatnot. Now, obviously, for a Jewish person, this is quite difficult. Jews cannot acknowledge another God other than God himself. And so there had been this kind of fundamental tension there. But for the most part, Romans had decided to leave Jews alone, in large part because Jews didn't do a whole lot of proselytizing. There wasn't really this idea that the Jewish people were out there to convert mass numbers of people in the Roman Empire to their faith. Now, there were some converts, but it was never a central mission of the Jewish faith. Now, the same can't be said for Christianity, right? When Christianity starts to branch off from Judaism, it does so in large part by reaching out and trying to convert people. And this, therefore, poses a threat to the Roman political authorities. You have this growing number of people throughout the empire who are ascribing to a belief system that is not consistent with what they believe it means to be Roman. These Christians refuse to perform sacrifices to the dead emperors. They refuse to acknowledge certain key aspects of Roman religious culture and things like that. And even worse, they are actively trying to convert people. And as such, these Christians are viewed as a threat by some Roman leaders. And this enters into a period of Christian history that's marked by several short but very intense periods of persecution. The first of these is actually waged by the Emperor Nero. Nero very famously blames a huge fire in Rome on the Christians. This fire is, I believe, in 63 or 64 AD. And in the aftermath, there's several years of very intense persecution. This is when St. Paul and St. Peter are both executed. Many of the other apostles are martyred, and many early Christian leaders suffer quite tremendously, to the point where there is speculation among some scholars that the Antichrist referred to in the book of Revelations is actually meant to be a representation of Nero. Now, Nero is not the last Roman emperor to persecute Christians. As I said, there are periods of persecution through the next 200 years. Now, unlike sometimes is commonly assumed, this persecution was not constant. There were periods of persecution, oftentimes lasting a year or several years. But for the most part, Christians were kind of ostracized and pushed off to the side more than they were persecuted. And because of this, Christians developed a kind of early symbology in which they were able to communicate with one another in a discreet way. One of the most famous of these images, I don't have it here, but is called the ichthus. This is the Greek phrase ichthus, what we sometimes describe as the Jesus fish that you oftentimes see on the back of cars and stuff like that. Now, ichthus stands for Jesus Christ, Son of God, our Savior, and it was a means by which Christians could basically show each other that they were Christian without being very overt about it, without being very ostentatious about it. Just because Christians weren't always persecuted didn't mean that they were always viewed with favor, and thus it paid to be discreet for many early Christians. And because of this, a lot of the early Christian artwork is actually found in very hidden locations, like the catacombs underneath Rome. This was not so much because the Christians were hiding, as it was because Christians could not own public buildings as a congregation. They found it difficult to, have public displays of art and things like that because they were technically illegal or a banned faith. So a lot of the most fabulous forms of early Christian art are found in these catacombs underneath the city of Rome and other cities as well. And one of the things that emerges during this time period is a very interesting kind of discussion happening through artwork of who exactly Jesus was, right? Many of these Christians, partly because they have to operate slightly below the surface and partly because they can't have a formal structure that kind of governs and unifies the whole church, becomes a very diverse group of thought about who Jesus was, Jesus' relationship with God, who Mary was, and all of these different aspects of it. And because of this, many of the early Christian leaders spend a lot of time writing books and tracts trying to stamp out ideas that they found to be outside the bounds and trying to shape some kind of coherent belief system that most Christians could ascribe to. So some of the great early writers, Origen and Tertullian and people like that, are actually focused on this idea of kind of this underground movement that's trying to form itself into a coherent whole and struggling against the restraints that they have from being informal and underground. Now, the reason that this is important is because as the situation begins to change in Rome, more and more people are being attracted to this faith. And one of the big reasons for this is that the Roman Empire enters a period of sustained crisis during the 200s. It's sometimes called the crisis of the 3rd century. There is a series of political assassinations at the top of the Roman Empire. There is huge political instability. And as a result, there is a long-term civil war across the empire. Add to this the fact that there is an early outbreak of bubonic plague, very apropos for the moment, unfortunately, known as Cyprian's plague. that spreads across the Roman Empire and kills somewhere around 20 to 30% of the population. And this is a pretty grim time. Trade breaks down, politics breaks down, civil war is ravaging the land, the economy is despoiled, the plague is rampaging across the empire. And as such, you can probably imagine that a lot of people in the Roman Empire are beginning to look for alternative ways of finding spiritual comfort in the face of such uncertainty. Christianity is not the only religion at this time that is gaining popularity because of this. There are numerous religions called mystery religions that begin to emerge and spread across the Roman Empire, some of which share some similarities to Christianity, but many of which do emphasize this kind of personal belief system that maybe was slightly different than the kind of public belief system of other forms of Roman religious practice. One of the most important of these is a religion called Mithraism that emerges out of the Eastern Mediterranean world and spreads across the Roman Empire. Now, a while ago, scholars argued that Christianity actually kind of took a lot of beliefs from these mystery religions, but other people have disputed that. But what remains pretty certain is that all these flourishing different religions, of which Christianity was one, were really taking shape in this marketplace of religious beliefs that were trying to provide spiritual comfort for people, right? And so as Christianity begins to grow, and alongside some of these other mystery faiths, they again correspondingly become an increasing threat to the empire. And one of the last great persecutions that takes shape in the early Christian church happens under the leadership of one of the last great Roman emperors named Diocletian. Diocletian was a really forward-thinking administrator in a lot of ways. He tried to reorganize the structure of the empire to make it easier to rule, but eventually gave way to one of the most intense periods of religious persecution against Christians beginning around the year 303. Now, it wasn't just Christians who were persecuted. Diocletian also ordered the persecution of other members of some of these mystery faiths as well, in large part because Diocletian believed that all of these faiths, Christianity amongst them, were kind of pulling apart the unity of the empire, that people were believing all these different things and they weren't believing in the traditional kind of Roman belief system anymore. And this was part of the reason why the empire was fragmenting and pulling apart and having such crisis. Now, this persecution on the part of Diocletian wasn't over the entire empire. It was mostly in the Eastern Empire, and it was pretty intense for a number of years, but eventually petered out. And Diocletian himself actually retired as the Roman Empire in 308. It was a kind of a unique circumstance. And in the aftermath of Diocletian's retirement, yet another civil war broke out for the future of the Roman Empire. And one of the leaders that emerged as one of the chief contenders for the throne of the empire was a general named Constantine. Constantine had actually been his father had been a kind of minor leader underneath Diocletian, ruling over parts of what's now today Britain and France. And it seems likely, based off of the texts that we have, that Constantine's mother was a Christian. Now, at some point during this war for the throne, Constantine faced off against another contender for the throne at a place called the Milvian Bridge. Now, later on, Constantine would tell people that before this battle, he actually received a vision of the Chi Rho, which is an early Christian symbol which represented the first two letters of the word Christ, and that he saw a cross in this vision as well, and that he heard a phrase, "By this sign you will conquer," and Constantine had the Chi Rho put on his battle standard and won this battle in the year 312. Now, this could be later propaganda come up with by Constantine and some of his scholars and stuff like that. But the fact of the matter is that after Constantine wins this battle and begins his process of unifying the Roman Empire, he does issue something called the Edict of Milan in 313, which together with another ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire basically ends the formal persecution of Christians and legalizes Christianity for the first time. Now, many people have wondered why Constantine does this. They've wondered whether it was because his mother was a Christian or if he himself was actually a Christian. We don't really know. This coin here, stamped right after his victory, doesn't have Jesus in the background. It has another god from this time period known as Sol Invictus. And so, obviously, even after this battle, Constantine's still kind of religiously pluralistic, I guess you could say. But the fact of the matter is that after 313, Christianity is legalized. And some people have theorized that this is in part because Constantine realizes that the old Roman way is dying, and that he needs a new ideology to bind together the empire after decades of instability and war. He needs something to glue the empire together, and he sees Christianity as being that glue. That Christians exist throughout the empire. They will be grateful to him for legalizing Christianity. They will become a loyal constituency for him. And he can use this kind of fast-growing, important religious faith that's spread throughout the empire to kind of weld together his political movement and bring unity to the church, right? Now, this is a great idea in theory, except for the fact that Constantine maybe was ignorant of the fact that Christianity was far from a unified force itself, right? As I said, these centuries of being an underground movement, different strains of thought had developed in Christianity. And if Constantine believed that by removing persecution, Christianity would bring the whole empire together, he was going to be sadly mistaken. And that's in large part because when Christians have the threat of persecution lifted from them, they become more able to communicate with each other on a regular basis, and divisions between Christians become much more apparent. One of these divisions was between some of the Christian leaders that adhered to a belief system closer to our own, and one led by a monk named Arius. Arius was from Alexandria in Egypt, and Arius believed that Jesus Christ was not fully God because he believed that Jesus Christ was created by God and therefore could not be part of the Trinity as it would later be formulated. So just at this moment, when Constantine hopes that Christianity is going to provide this glue to bring the empire together, all of a sudden you have these divisions erupting. And as you can probably imagine, Constantine is pretty exasperated by this. And as he establishes control over the whole empire and unifies the whole empire, he is going to see that it will be extremely important for him as the political leader of Rome to call together the Christian church to settle once and for all on what it means to be Christian. And that's where we're going to end our lecture today, and where we'll pick up our next lecture. Because when Constantine calls these people together, he calls them to a city called Nicaea. And there the Council of Nicaea is going to battle for the future of the Christian church. So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you for listening. And please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. And I will be back hopefully later this week or next week with lecture number 2. Thank you very much. Bye.